Good afternoon. This is Ben Woodbury. I'm with the Friends of History, and I want to welcome you to the second of our online video lecture presentations. Our goal is to now continue the first Wednesday lectures online until such time as the History Museum opens, and we welcome you and all your friends to join in. So I would encourage you. We will be sending out email announcements on this about the middle of each month, and so just keep an eye on it. Obviously, if you're on here, you've seen those emails or found them on Facebook, which is great. So today we're fortunate to have with us New Mexico's new state historian, Rob Martinez, and he has looking forward to presenting on his Mulattos of Cochiti, caste and race in Spanish Colonial New Mexico. We're quite excited to hear this. So that you're aware, once the presentation has been given, Rob will be available online to answer any questions. You will be able to ask your questions on the chat room lists, which are below the video presentation on Facebook, and also on YouTube, should you be online for that. So without further ado, I will turn this over to Rob Martinez. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Robert Martinez, State Historian of New Mexico. Today I want to talk to you about Mulattos of Cochiti, caste and race in Spanish Colonial New Mexico. Let's start with a quote by Don Pedro Pino from 1812. In New Mexico, there are no castas of African origin. My province is probably the only one with this prerogative in all of Spanish America. At no time has any casta of people of African origin been known there. Spaniards and pure Indians that are hardly distinguishable from ourselves are the ones who make up the total of 40,000 inhabitants. Pedro Pino was New Mexico's representative to the Spanish Cortes in Cadiz, Spain in 1812, and he was reporting to the king. And what he said was true to him and from what he knew about New Mexico at that time, but he didn't know that there had been people of African origin and other races in New Mexico previous in the last 200 years from his time. So he can be forgiven, but what's fascinating is he also says that the Spaniards and pure Indians are almost the same. We need to think about this because he's talking about casta, caste, and that has to do with mixing of races. Let's look at the periodization of New Mexico history connected to Mexico. In 1519, Hernan Cortés conquered Tenochtitlan, Mexico City. By 1535, the viceroy was put in place, Antonio de Mendoza, virrey, that's the official Spanish government. And then 1598 to 1821, this is New Mexico's Spanish colonial period. 1821 to 1848 were Mexican, and then 1850 to 1912 were a territory of the United States, and finally statehood in 1912 when we were considered worthy of that honor and gift. Look at this map of the Camino Real. This shows how people, ideas, food, things, products were transported throughout the Spanish Empire. Royal roads, Caminos Reales. This one goes from Mexico City in the south all the way through Querétaro, Guanajuato, Zacatecas, up through Durango into Chihuahua, Paso del Norte, and up to Santa Fe here in New Mexico. This is how we become a place of mixed race population. Let's look at the 1500s in Nueva España, New Spain. Initially, the Spaniards had a nice basic idea. There would be a República Española, a Spanish republic, and the República India, an Indian republic. And that worked at first, except Spanish and human condition being what it is, people started to intermix. There were few Spanish people in New Spain, Nueva España, compared to Native Americans. And initially, the offspring of Spanish and Indian was considered Español, just Spanish. But this changes as the population of mixed blood people starts to overcome that of both the Spanish and Indian populations. So that middle group of mixed blood mestizo people starts to expand. And the Spanish feel a need to control that, or at least try to control it. The 1600s in Nueva España. Things change as Africans are brought to New Spain as slaves and freemen. At first, there were striking contrasts between Indians and blacks, Spanish and Indians, and blacks and Spanish. In other words, at first the populations were fairly separate, but things start to get complicated when interracial mixing took place. What do you do about all those people who did not fit nicely into just black, Native American, and Spanish categories? The 1700s in New Spain. A Spanish colonial society became racially and ethnically complex. Remember, this is the Age of Enlightenment. There's the scientific revolution, and it became popular to categorize things. Animals, plants, and then, of course, humans. Why not? This leads to an obsession with race, and not just among the Spanish. The British have it, the French, but in Mexico, Nueva España, there's this obsession with race and the different mixing that's going on. So let's talk about caste. What is caste? Casta is the word in Spanish. The people of India have a caste system. It's a way of organizing society up and down. In India, it's the higher classes or the priestly class, and at the lower end, the untouchables. A very rigid system. But the one in New Spain in the 1700s, it's very strict in places like Mexico City or Puebla or Guadalajara, Zacatecas. But when you get to outlying areas like New Mexico, we'll see it becomes very fluid. So we need to talk about church records, because this is one of the ways that the Spanish are able to start categorizing humanity throughout the Spanish Empire. And this happens also in the Philippines. It's very similar to what happens in Nueva España and New Spain and Mexico and New Mexico. But what we see happening is that the Council of Trent from 1545 to 1563, this is a Catholic Church council that was called to address the movement led by Martin Luther, the priest, but it also addressed things like sacraments, the need to record them because of the movement of people taking place because of the Americas. Spaniards are starting to move and live in other parts of the world, so they need proof that they've been baptized, that they've been confirmed, receiving sacraments, and being married. So by 1585, you see records of baptisms, marriage information, marriages, burials in New Spain, and they start to be separated based on race and ethnicity, like Spanish, Indian, and other casta designations. In fact, it's 1603 where we see the first casta registers at the Sagrario. That's the cathedral in Mexico City. And as you can imagine, this leads to a lot of confusion for priests because it's a very complicated system to try to navigate. There's a lot of ambiguity and confusion and even indifference in these records. So they tell us a lot about the population, but they also tell us a lot about the people who are recording these casta race designations. Mestizo designation is very inconsistent. Typically that meant half Spanish and half Indian, mestizo. But these mestizo people show up everywhere. Sometimes they're in a casta book, sometimes they're in an Espanol or Spanish book, and sometimes they show up in an Indian or Indio book. By the 1800s, the Crown insists again that priests must record casta calidad. In other words, if you don't know exactly what the racial mix is. What quality are they? Are they of a quality of being Spanish, a quality of Indian, a quality of half African or half Indian? It gets very difficult and ambiguous, as you can see. The local bishop goes on to say that the priest must register that they administer the sacrament, but the rest is not that important. In other words, it's important that they baptize the baby, but it doesn't really matter if you get the casta designation correct. Whatever they are told about caste or what their perception is. In other words, if the parents say, somos mestizos, we're mestizos, then fine, write that down. Or if the priest looks at them and says, parecen mulattos, they look mulattos, he'll just write that in. And there's a lot of that goes into that. It's not just what the priest perceives, it's how they perceive themselves and how the community perceives the people. Calidad versus status. Calidad de casta was often secondary to one's station in life. Again, quality. What often mattered was wealth versus poverty, your occupation, whether it was a high level or a low level job, and how one dressed or carried themselves. In other words, if you dressed a certain way and carried yourself a certain way, you might fall into a higher level of the caste system. Or if you acted in a not so pleasant way, you could get a lower level of caste designation applied to you. Skin color also mattered. Obviously, lighter skin meant more Espanol, darker meant more mulatto, half black, half Spanish, or more Indio or mestizo. Look at this document. This is a casta system in Spanish Colonial Mexico. Very complicated. There's about 18 or so designations. At the top is Espanol, Spanish, and at the bottom you see words like lobo, animal names. You see mestizo, mulatto, and it's just the varying degrees. But let's look at the top. Espanol and Indio produces mestizo. Then it says Espanol and mestizo produces castizo. That means you're a quarter Indian, 3/4 Spanish. But then a castizo in Espanol presents, voila, an Espanol. You have been Spanishized. Let's talk about genizados because genizados are important to New Mexico's casta system. They're not in the typical casta designation, but they are important to our history here in New Mexico. We first hear about genizados here in the early 1700s when Vargas, the reconquistador of New Mexico, used the term to describe some Native Americans here in New Mexico. It means janissary or auxiliary. It comes from the Ottoman Turks. They would take captive Christian boys and raise them and train them as warriors and then push them out to the front to go into battle first. So that's where this term comes from. In New Spain, you also see the term Ladino, and this was used to designate a highly Hispanicized Indian or one who spoke Spanish really well. It's not to do with Ladino, the language of the Sephardic Jews of Spain. That's something else. Sometimes people get confused. But in the New World, in the Americas, Ladino means a Hispanicized Indian. In New Mexico, for the most part, genizados were non-Pueblo Native Americans. I mean, sometimes Pueblos ended up as genizados, but these were cautivos, captive people who were taken captive by other Native Americans, nomadic groups, and they would be brought and put in Hispano households as servants, which is a nice word for it. It was a form of slavery in the 1700s, and it went back and forth. It was also Hispanics raiding the Comanches, the Apaches, and taking children and women from the Ute people and putting them into their homes. And these folks would be catechized, baptized, and given Christian names, turned into Catholic Hispanic people, at least ideally. But in actuality, they were marginalized. They were no longer members of their original tribal community, and yet they were not totally accepted into Hispano society. In 1733, we see the first attempt to have a community of genizados at Sandia Pueblo or in that vicinity, but they're turned down. In the 1750 census, we see genizados recorded at Taos, in Rio Arriba, and Belen. And later, they are part of the establishment of the community of San Miguel del Vado. Abiquiu. I love this photo. It's from the late 1800s. Abiquiu is a very renowned Genízaro community. It's established, I think, around 1753, 1754. The Genízaros were there. They were a buffer. All these communities were buffer communities to the marauding nomadic groups like the Comanches and Utes. And so, as you can imagine, these were very dangerous places to live. Let me be very clear. There were Hispano people living in these communities as well, adjacent to them. And so there was a lot of interplay in a lot of ways with Genízaros and with Hispanos between the two communities. But Abiquiu is very much known as a Genízaro community, and it still is. Let's look at this marriage record from Sandia Pueblo from 12th December 1782. This is from my family history. This is a marriage record between Josef Antonio Jaramillo. He's designated an Español, and he married Juana Montoya, mestiza. That means she's half Spanish and half Indian. She's half Español. But let's be clear, Josef Antonio Jaramillo, in a record like this from 1782, his family's been here for generations. He's not from Spain, and he's not of only Spanish European ancestry. Odds are he has Native American ancestry too, but he has evolved, and his family has become considered Español. This one is from Cochiti, and it references the title of this talk, Mulattos of Cochiti. There was a period in the 1770s when the priest there, his name right there, Fray Estanislao Mariano de Marulanda, he started calling everybody there in the documents Mulattos, or de calidad mulatto. This is my ancestor Julian Ramon. He's designated mulatto in the margins, and then his parents are Alonso de Salas and Juana Maria Paez. They're vecinos de la Cañada de Cochiti. That's a Hispanic community that was adjacent to the pueblo, and they're described as calidad mulattos. This might mean they looked mulatto. It might mean they were mulatto, half Spanish, half African. But also, he's kind of putting them down by saying they are of a mulatto quality. For a person like him, we'll see, he was a high-level Español from New Spain. And coming to a place like New Mexico, he definitely looked down on the people. And it turns out later on, he was going blind, it turned out. So he might have also had a hard time seeing these people. But nevertheless, he called everyone at Cochiti mulattos in the 1770s. Here's a burial record for Alonso Salas, the father of Ramon. And look at that. It says that Alonso Salas was que murió. He died the day before, the antes. He's called an Español. The reason I'm showing you this is it shows how fluid in New Mexico, how you could be considered a mulatto in one record and an Español in another record. So we have to take all of this with a grain of salt. Here's the marriage record for Julian Ramon Salas a couple decades later. And this record at Cochiti, I have it underlined. There's his name, Julian Ramon Salas. He's single, soltero, and he's listed as an Español. So there you go. It's fascinating to me how these designations move and shake and shape people. Let's talk about the priest, Fray Estanislao Mariano Marulanda. It's important that we know his perspective. He was Estanislao Mariano de Marulanda y Ramirez. He was born in Ozumba, Mexico around 1734. His parents were Jose Antonio Marulanda and Estefania Ramirez. His first cousin was a renowned priest, scientist, historian, and writer, Jose Antonio de Alzate y Ramirez. So we see these are high-level Hispanics, Spaniards. They're Españoles, but they're even more than the Español class in the casta system. They're criollos. They are Spanish born of Spanish parents, Spanish born in the Americas of Spanish parents. And there's an image we have of Jose Antonio de Alzate y Ramirez. I put that there because I'd like to think that's what our priest looked like. He probably looked something like this. But these are high-level people coming to a place that probably to them is the sticks. It's the edge of empire. It's the frontier. Sor Juana Ines de la Cruz. Why do I have her here? Well, look at her name. Juana Ines de Asbaje y Ramirez de Santillana. She was a high-level person, very famous poet from Mexico, but she has that Ramirez name, and we think that our priest was related to her. But it's important because you could see that she was of the upper classes, highly educated, and she was also born out of wedlock. This is an aspect of casta, this illegitimacy, being born where you don't know who your father is. She was of that situation, and yet it didn't impact her career or her status in Spanish colonial society, because we see in all these records, hijos naturales, children naturally born, or hijos de la iglesia, children of the church. I love that designation. They're never called illegitimate, or rarely are they. So why does this matter? Why does pedigree matter? What, not just racial background, but your status as a legitimate child as opposed to a natural child? Well, again, those criollos, they're Spanish born in the Americas. People like the priest at Cochiti and a lot of priests and governors who came to New Mexico in the Spanish period, they held economic power. They held church power with peninsulares. Those are the Spaniards born in Spain from the Spanish peninsula. But they held little or no political power, and they held little or no military power. This will drive Mexican independence a century later, because these criollos, they want their own power and they want their own country. But when they had a chance, they would lord what power they did have over mestizos, mulattos, castizos, we'll see, people of mixed blood in the areas where they had authority. What is calidad? This means quality or status. It has to do with your skin color, your occupation, how much money you have, the so-called purity of your blood, the limpieza de sangre, the cleanliness of your blood. The Spaniards didn't want you to have any Jewish blood or Moorish blood. They were actually quite forgiving of Native American blood, not so much of African. So you could see it was a very dodgy situation. Also, your integrity and your place of origin could either lift you up or knock you down in the Spanish colonial hierarchy of society. Legitimacy. People of mixed blood often were just considered illegitimate. Calidad was determined not only by skin color, but again, social and moral attributes. Casta paintings. Let's talk about these images. They're quite amazing. These paintings were commissioned to illustrate the population the king, queen in Spain were ruling over. They didn't travel around their world empire. They had it brought to them. So these paintings not only showed the various mixing of races, but it also showed how they dressed, how they ate, how they lived. And some of the paintings we'll see were warnings to not do that, to not mix the races. Again, a very racist and race-obsessed system. I mentioned this before, whitening or washing. This is how it happens. An Espanol and an Indian have a mestizo, and if their child then has a child with a Española, they have a child then with a castiza, their child is Espanol. This is how you become part of the Espanol part of the casta system. Look at this image. De negro y de India sale lobo. From a black and an Indian, a lobo. Lobo is an animal, a wolf. That's not a very nice name, and it's a very violent combination according to this painting. But it shows you how you're supposed to dress too. If you stepped outside of that in Mexico City or Guadalajara, you could get in trouble with the church, with the Inquisition, or with civil authorities. De Español y Negra, mulatto. A little calmer because there's a Spaniard involved. Mulata, that little kid's having a hard time, mom and dad are fighting. There's an Española mulata that produces a morisca. That means a morisco is part African. In Spain, a morisco is a Moor, but in the New World, it just means part African and part Spanish. There's another morisca. He's obviously telling the wife to be quiet, very domineering, and she's not putting up with him. She's asking, what have you been up to? De Español y de India produce a mestizo. From a Spaniard and an Indian, a mestizo. From a mestizo and an Indian, coyote. You see this term a lot in New Mexico. That means somebody who's mainly Indian, but maybe a little Spanish, a quarter Spanish. So mestizo and Indian produces a coyote. from Español, Mestiza, Castiza, almost Spanish, but still a quarter Indian. And then Castizo and Española produces an Española, voila, a Spanish person who has mixed race ancestry. Castas, there you go. So those images are static, but they do tell us about race blending going on in New Spain and even New Mexico. It gives us certain cultural attributes, shows images of food and furniture and clothing. And it does tell us something, but it doesn't tell us everything. And again, there are warnings about mixing races. Africans and mulattoes in New Mexico. We have a strong African history here. And contrary to what Pedro Pino thought in 1812, the first Spanish representative to the Pueblos in 1539 was Esteban the Moor. In 1598, one of Oñate's colonists was a man named Alvaro Garcia Holgado. He was a mulatto. In 1598, Cristobal López de Ávila is from Oviedo, Spain. This is fascinating. He was listed as mulatto, and he was described as swarthy and black-bearded. That shows that people from Spain could also be of African origin. Also with Oñate came one of our ancestors, a common ancestor to us all, Bartolomé Romero from Corral de Almaguer. I researched his family there in 1999. He was also described as dark and black-bearded. Was he mulatto? Maybe. He was a colonist. I'm not saying he was or wasn't. I'm just saying it's something to think about. Black slaves were part of the 1598 expedition. Some of them escaped and never came up here, but many did end up coming here. Vargas in 1692, 1693, he brought an African drummer to New Mexico named Sebastián de Rodriguez. He established a family in New Mexico, and Sebastián's grandkids settled Las Trampas, which was also a buffer community made up of Genizaros and mixed blood people. I have roots there on my dad's side. So Fray Esteban de Perea was a priest in New Mexico in 1631. We're going to see what some of these Spanish people had to say about us New Mexicans, okay? Inhabitants of New Mexico are made up of so many mestizos, mulattos, and others who are worse, so dangerous and of little moral strength. It looked like Fray Esteban de Perea was embarrassed about us New Mexicans, the Hispanics and the Indians. He also said that he felt the local Pueblo people had a bad influence on the Spanish colonists. Fray Alonso de Posada in 1661, he said, New Mexico has no more than 100 citizens or vecinos. These would be non-Pueblo people. And he said they're mulattos, mestizos, and all have Spanish blood, though it is slight. Fray Francisco Atanasio Dominguez in 1776. He said of the people of Santa Cruz, suffice to say that most of them pass for Spaniards. We need to pay attention to that phrase. I used to think it meant, oh yeah, we're pretty much Spanish. Well, he does mean that, but he also means something else. About the people of Las Trampas, for the most part, they are a ragged lot. They are as festive as they are poor and very merry. They are low class, and there are very few of good or even moderately good blood. Well, I guess he wasn't the party guy, but those are my people, and I love them, and I'm proud of them. Fray Ambrosio Guerra in 1801, he said about the people of Albuquerque, all are vecinos, most are genizaros, which is a mixture of various nations, and the rest are mulattos, coyotes, and a few Spanish, although most consider themselves Spanish without it being so. They speak no other language other than poorly understood Castilian. Well, we hadn't been close to Madrid or Mexico City, centers of learning, for a couple of centuries, so give us a break. Our Spanish was a mix of archaic phrases, Old Spanish, Pueblo words, Genizaro words, Mexican, Aztec words, so it reflected our history. Passing for Spanish. Listen to this phrase from 1774, this quote. Many pass for Spaniards who in their own hearts know they are mulattoes. Well, there you go. Passing as a Spaniard was a serious threat to the maintenance and alignment of the social order, which required constant management and surveillance. Well, New Mexico had a lot of people here already and coming and going. There were Spaniards here. We have Spanish roots, Spanish ancestry, but that's not all. We have other people in there as well. Español, that term is interesting. It's a casta term in this situation. In New Mexico, it did not mean you were from Spain or of only Spanish ancestry. It meant that you were culturally Spanish, more or less, visually as well, sometimes, and ethnically Spanish. But it didn't mean that you did not have Indian blood. You probably did, and also mulatto probably. So those are New Mexico castas. Let's look at later ethnic designations for New Mexico Hispanos. Throughout the centuries, especially when we get into the American period, we're called Spanish American, Chicano, Mexican American, Hispanic, Indo-Hispano, Latino, Crypto-Jews, Hispano again, and Latinx and Chicanx. We've been everything and we are everything. That's what I love about our history. We've got it all. If you want to emphasize your Spanish past, you can. If you want to emphasize your Mexican past, you can. You can emphasize your Native American, African, Jewish, Muslim. We've got it all. So look at this. Modern day casta system, DNA. It's very big now. We're going to look at my results. Well, my Y DNA, my paternal chromosome, is JM172. That's the Middle East, from Iraq. So at some point, my paternal ancestor traveled from the Middle East through the Mediterranean to Spain and then to Mexico to New Mexico. My mitochondrial DNA, my mom's side, my mom's chromosome is B45. That's Native American, which makes sense. Typically, we're showing the maternal chromosome as being a Native American. But look at my percentage breakdown. I'm roughly 50% European, 31% Native American. A Middle Eastern, about 8%. That means Berber, North African for the most part. Jewish, 4%, and miscellaneous, 7%. There's some other European and African as well. So I'm going to end with this quote by Octavio Paz. I love this. He wrote, "The strange food, the colors, the landscapes, the women with different skin and eyes, Indian, mestizo, mulatto, the complicity of the sun and the vegetation, the voluptuousness of the climate, all this stirred the imagination, the senses." And there's a Casta family from 1970. That's my family. That droopy guy at the bottom is me when I was a kid. That's my mom and dad with me. My 3 sisters and my older brother. We're the Martinez family from northern New Mexico. So there you go. That's the end of my presentation. Thank you for joining me. There's contact information, Office of the State Historian. There's my phone number and email if you want to contact me. And please check out our website at www.newmexicohistory.org. Take care. Hasta luego. Bye.